Hi, and welcome to the video 19. Man, I can't believe it's already 19, in which I want to talk about Polyneoptera. So before diving right into it, let's see what we mean by Polyneoptera. So Polyneoptera is one of those groups that is not really well characterized in terms of its morphology or behavior or anything like that. It's obviously a very ancient group, and frankly, the fact that the molecular data support the Polyneoptera comes as a bit of a surprise to me. But we'll take the data as it exists for the time being. Basically, we're going to be talking about, in the course of this video, 10 different, count it right? Yeah, 10 different orders of insects. So I'm not going to really be able to spend a whole lot of time on any one of these. Otherwise, this would turn into we could talk about this for days, quite literally. So I want to at least introduce some of these to you, because some of them are not going to be the kind of things you run across every day unless you live in. I don't think there's any parts of the world where all of these orders live at the same time. So it's quite a diverse group of insects, and I'm going to try to be covering them in the same order that they are presented in the Misoff et al. One Kite Project paper. So the orders are, just to get this on the books, are the Zoraptera, the Dermaptera, Plecoptera, Orthoptera, Mantophasmatodia, Grilloblatodia, Embiodina, Phasmatodia, Mantodia, and Blatodia. So what can we say about the Polyneoptera in terms of its characteristics? They are represented in the fossil record by many early fossils, and by early I'm talking about Upper Carboniferous. So these are the time when the first winged insects appear. And so many of these represent stem group fossils. Usually we think of the living species as the crown group, crowning the top of the phylogenetic tree, and back down more basal, we see these things appearing as stem groups. And of course, as stem groups, they retain lots of plesiomorphic characters. And frankly, that's in terms of morphological recognition of Polyneoptera. Basically, we're talking about generalized plesiomorphic ancestral characters. So, for example, things like the possession of incomplete metamorphosis. So wings are developing externally. We have gradual metamorphosis through the nymphal or the nymphal stages, or the naiad stages in the cases of the aquatic species. That don't have a tremendous transformation in body shape, form, ecology, etc., going from the immatures to the adult stages. They have mandibulate mouth parts. Now, the trophic level that are occupied by species is all over the board. We have scavengers, we have phytophagous species, we have predaceous species, we have parasitic species, but in terms of the way their mouth parts are formed, they are basically mandibulate mouth parts. As a general rule, and you'll see some exceptions right away as I get into talking about the orders, if they have wings, then members of the Polyneoptera tend to have rather complex wing venation, and by that I mean they have a relatively complete set of the basic longitudinal wing veins, so starting with the costa and proceeding posteriorly, costa, subcosta, radius, cubitus, anal region, and jugal veins. And in addition to that, there's typically a lot of branching of those major longitudinal veins combined with cross veins that give the wings a very net-like, the venation of the wings, a very net-like appearance. And that net-like venational pattern is known as an archidictyon. Also, the wings, the hind wings, if they have them, have relatively large anal regions. That is a posterior lobe of the hind wing. And interestingly, and this might be an apomorphic feature, but it could also just as easily be a convergent feature. Many species are characterized by asymmetric male genitalia. And of course, male genitalia are commonly used to identify things at the species level, and we're not going to get to that. But I do want to show you some pictures of some genitalia so that you can understand what I mean when I say that they are asymmetrical. But first, this is the first group, and all the rest of the groups are going to fall into a monophyletic taxon known as the Neoptera, or the new wings group. And these are characterized, their primary features that they're characterized by wing flexion that is effected by the rotation about the third axillary sclerite. Now I know I've talked about this several times and kind of done my little judo sort of moves in order to illustrate what I'm talking about. Let me get into a little bit more detail here. Someday I wish somebody would generate a 3D movable model so we could watch a movie of how wing flexion occurs, but haven't seen that yet. Maybe one of you can do that. So in this image, let me get my laser pointer here. Okay, so in this image, this is a diagram supposed to be showing a wing, which is going to continue out here to the right-hand side of the screen. So this is just the base of the wing, where it attaches to the tergum of a thoracic segment, and the points at which the sclerites, these sclerites in between, attach to the tergum, are basically at 2 points. At a process or a protrusion anteriorly called the anterior nodal wing process, here it's abbreviated ANP, and posteriorly at the posterior nodal wing process back here. So those are the 2 points of contact of the wing and its sclerites, axillary sclerites, or another name you'll see used for these is terralia. And then let's see, so we can walk through these. Well, first of all, here's your major longitudinal veins, costa, subcosta, radius, where's the media? I guess it's coming out farther. Cubitus, they're using a terminology that includes post-cubitus or cubitus posterior, anterior anal, posterior anal wing veins, and back here the jugal veins. So this is more or less the wing venational pattern espoused by Jarmila Kukulova-Peck, paleontologist that I mentioned in the past in the context, I think it was, of Monora. So what these little sclerites here are doing is they're basically translating the movements of the thorax that are generated by the flight muscles in the thorax. Remember, we talked about indirect flight musculature. Those huge muscles are contracting and distorting the thorax, and those movements are then translated via these sets of tiny sclerites into the detailed movement of the wing, not only elevation and depression and promotion and remotion, but supination and pronation. You can't see my hands. That's turning the supination is turning the costal margin of the wing downward. Where's my hand? There we go, downward. And that's pronation, sorry. Supination is the opposite, turning the costal margin upwards. And so we have these complex motions of the wings. And the forces are being transmitted from the thorax through the axillary sclerites to the veins. So we have a first axillary sclerite, which is attached to the anterior nodal wing process. And then it's articulated to the second axillary sclerite. The first axillary sclerite also articulates with the subcostal vein here. The second axillary articulates with the first axillary, the radial vein, and with the third axillary, and also these medial sclerites in the middle here. So we have first, second. Now we get to the real crux of the matter in terms of wing flexion, the third axillary sclerite. The third axillary sclerite articulates with the second axillary sclerite anteriorly. Posteriorly, it articulates with the posterior nodal wing process. And distally, I guess we could say, it's articulating with the anal veins and the postcubitus here, indirectly. So what happens is that there is a muscle that attaches directly on the underside. This is looking from the top. A muscle that attaches via a tendon to the underside of the third axillary sclerite, right about here. And when that muscle contracts, the third axillary sclerite rotates about an axis between its articulation with the second and its articulation with the posterior nodal wing process. So this whole thing is being pulled downward. So this point here is going down, dragging with it all of these veins to which it's connected. And the wing then folds along a line of flexion here. You see this little business here, indicating there's a fold line here and the dotted line here also. That the wing is folding there. So the third axillary sclerite pulls the wing down, folds it underneath, and then it's all shifted over the back. So that's what I've been talking about when I've been mentioning wing flexion. And all the Neoptera do this via the third axillary sclerite. Of course, there are all sorts of secondary evolutionary modifications. Some Neoptera have lost wings, and so this is entirely irrelevant. Others have lost the ability to flex their wings, things like butterflies. But that's if they have normal wings and not highly modified wings, then this is the mechanism they're using. So that's what makes the Neoptera. So I just here's some early fossils. These are upper Carboniferous fossils of things that I guess we would place in yeah. Now I'm mixing up my names. Polyneoptera here. So we can see, what can we see here? You can see some wing veins here. You can see they have quite a number of wing veins. These are the same fossil, by the way, just that it's been split in half and opened up. So you're seeing, I guess this looks like it's hard to tell. It looks like this might be a dorsal view, and then it's split along the inside, so you're looking through the insides of the animal here. That's why paleontologists get paid the big bucks to figure out these fine details. The next picture shows the same fossil, but they've highlighted these areas and also made some interpretations about what you're seeing here. So some of the features might be a little bit clearer. So here we're looking at the animal from the dorsal side. Pronotum, the wings, you can see those same wing veins here. The head underneath with the antennae coming out, and they've highlighted the appendages in color here. This is looking at it from the ventral side, coxa, hind coxa, femur, tibia, tarsus down here. These look like middle legs, forelegs, antennae, and again you can see this extensive radiation of veins here. So they have one of the common things you see in Polyneoptera, and not doing a quick survey in my head, not in most other Neoptera, is the relatively complete and extensive veination here. Doesn't mean everybody has it, doesn't mean that nobody else has it anywhere else, but it's one of the characteristics of Polyneoptera. This is just a modern cockroach showing you just how crazy the wing veination can go. Let's look particularly at the hind wing. You can see this is that line along which the hind wing folds when the wing is flexed and brought in back over the body. So this is that large expanded anal region of the wing I was talking about. And here we see, look at this vein with all the branches coming off of here. Those are many more than the usual number of branches you see characterized by, I'm not even going to try to interpret which wing vein that is, media or radius or something like that. So this is, and also you can see, particularly over on this side, the light lines showing the cross veins here. So we have extensive longitudinal veination with lots of branching and then lots of cross veins interconnecting them. An archodiction. Here's a picture of some of those wild genitalia. This comes from a taxonomic paper of I believe it was cockroaches. I don't remember off the top of my head anymore, but this to me looks like cockroach genitalia, and you can see how, well, here you can see a subtle hint of how they are asymmetrical. So these are the apical sternites of the abdomen, and you see they're not quite mirror images of each other, but look at what's going on back here in terms of these genitalia. We've got these extravagant hooks. Here's another hook coming over here, claspers to grasp the female during copulation, and it can be, this is a different view of the same genitalia, so you can see how this hook is recurved and kind of scoops under. Just wild stuff going on in the male genitalia. If you ever get a chance, you should catch one of those German or brown-banded cockroaches, run across your desk, and dissect out the genitalia just to see how utterly amazing they are. Okay, so let's dive into the my brief discussion of the orders. What I'm going to do, this image comes from the Misoff et al. One Kite project paper, and so basically I'm going to treat the orders of Polyneoptera in the same order that they do here, although I'm going to differ a little bit on some of the names that are used, and also here we see something that is now, I think this was an homage to tradition here, to keep the cockroaches and termites as separate orders, because if you look back in the tree here, you see that while the termites are a monophyletic group, node number 113 back here, the cockroaches are not a monophyletic group, that the termites render the cockroaches a paraphyletic grouping. So who knows how widely accepted these things are, but now what we understand is that termites are really nothing more than highly modified cockroaches, and so I'm going to treat those as a single order, even though it's not done so here, and it's not done so in your textbook, to be honest with you. But anyway, I'm going to be walking through these and putting this image up several times just so we can stay oriented as we move through here. Looking at first this group here, which includes the Zooraptor and Dermaptera. Then take a look at the Plecoptera, which is the next branch up, and then we're going to jump over and talk about the major group within the Polyneoptera, the Orthoptera, major in terms of diversity in species numbers, and then this clade here, which includes the Mantophasmatodia, Gryllobolatodia, I'm calling them Embiodyna, and the Phasmatodia, and then the final clade with the mantids and the Blatodia coming off. So let's dive right in with maybe one of the most enigmatic insect orders of all, the Zooraptera. I'm also going to shy away from using some common names for some of these groups, simply because the common names are not widely used or widely recognized for sure. Zooraptor is one of them. You can find people that call them angel insects or ground lice or these kinds of things, but I don't think anybody really follows these things too religiously. The order Zooraptera, as you can see down at the bottom here, it's a very small group of insects with only 44 known species, and they're so bizarre that there was a little bit of a cottage industry in trying to find Zooraptera and document their diversity at one point in time. When they were originally described, and it's one of the orders of insects that is relatively recently described, it was thought that they were entirely wingless, and so that's the meaning of the ordinal name, Aptera meaning without wings, and Zor meaning pure, I believe, or perfect, pure, I think. So it turns out it's not true, and so the ordinal name is actually a bit of a misnomer, but it's what we use. We'll stick with it. These are very small. We're talking about a couple of millimeters long insects that are typically found in rotting wood or underneath bark or in sawdust, areas like this, and very little is known about their biology. They seem to be widely distributed across the world. There are It's found in North America. I've collected them in Jamaica. You know, they're found everywhere, but always very isolated, small groups. They're kind of how shall I say that they typically you may find a number of individuals living together, so they're not solitary, but they're not exhibiting any kind of true social behavior as well, other than just inter-individual interactions. Let's take a look at them. This is a female. It's this particular female is well melanized. That it's got a lot of color to it. You will find many individuals that are practically have no color whatsoever, other than just being white, almost translucent. But the female is perfectly wingless. You see the well-developed cerci in the back. This species and many species have well-developed hind femora. They do not jump, at least not as far as I'm aware, and very relatively simple antennae. And this kind of head shape, this sort of triangular head shape, at least the ones I've seen, it seems to be fairly characteristic. So that's what a female looks like, and here's your scale bar here. It's a millimeter, so you can see how large this animal is. This is a big Zorapteran. This is a male. Males can be winged, and so once they discovered the males, they finally found some wing things. I know that the first Zoraptor I ever collected was a male, and I looked at it, I had no clue what this thing was, because in my taxonomy course, I don't remember if we even had Zoraptor, and certainly we did not have any males to look at. So first of all, here we are, first Polyneoptera in order, and I'm breaking all the rules right away, right? Because this is not that extensive, relatively straightforward wing venation. No enlarged anal region in the hind wing, none of that. These are very strange, but this is a very typical wing venation. If you see a wing venation like this, you're pretty much confident, you can be pretty confident that what you're looking at is a Zoraptor. So the males do get out, they do fly about, they'll drop into traps, malaise traps or pan traps or things like that, and you'll occasionally run across them. They're a great insect to kind of quiz somebody to see how well they know their insect orders. I mean, that's all I have to say about Zoraptera, except for the fact that trying to place them within the phylogenetic tree on the basis of their morphological characters was extremely difficult. And maybe I should say this in the context of all of these relationships within the Polyneoptera that Misov et al. Propose, is that I'm not going to be very surprised that with an increase in what the systematists call taxon sampling, that is, increase in the number of species that are sequenced and analyzed in the course of a phylogenetic study, that we find that some of these relationships that they found, even though the analyses give them high bootstrap support, I will not be surprised to see some shifting around in there. So I'm not putting any money that this is the be-all and end-all in terms of figuring out Polyneopteran relationships. You can place your bet wherever you want to. It pays your money or takes your chances. Anyway, moving on to the earwigs, the order Dermaptera. By and large, I'm sure you're all familiar with earwigs. The vast majority of species of earwigs fit a kind of a common body plan, in that they have short, relatively hardened forewings that serve as protective structures for the hind wings. It's the hind wings that are primarily used to allow them to fly. But probably the most characteristic thing of all of them is the fact that the cerci are modified into a pair of pinchers at the posterior end of the animal. Now, we saw something similar to this in the Gepigids within the Diplora, and you'll also see things similar to that, for example, in beetle larvae. But it's one of the characteristic things of earwigs. These modified cerci are used in copulation, so articulation of the male and female during the process of copulation. In some cases, they're used for prey capture. Male-male aggression. They have a lot of they're using them for a lot of different behaviors. The cerci can be sexually dimorphic, with typically if a species is sexually dimorphic in the development of the cerci, the males are more elaborate and the female cerci are shorter. And sometimes the males have extremely long cerci, and these cerci can also be asymmetrical at times. And I'll have a picture of that in a second. So the small forewings and the larger hind wings. The hind wings, when at rest, are folded in this complex fan-like pattern underneath the small forewings. And deploying these wings for flight is quite an operation that I have a video to show you how they do that. Now, what I've described in terms of, what you see is your typical earwig with allowances for modification of exaggeration of this part of the body or exaggeration of that part of the body, is true for the vast majority of earwigs. But these are free-living earwigs. Typically, herbivores or feeding on rotting vegetable matter, but there can be some carnivorous or scavenging forms. But there are two lineages within the Dermaptera which break all of these rules. These lineages were formerly classified as suborders, so there was one suborder of the free-living earwigs, and then these two parasitic lineages. But now they're all lumped together in one. Overall, the Dermaptera is not a huge group of insects, only about 1,800 species now. Perhaps that feels like a lot of species to you, but there are, in some of the holometabolous groups, 1,800 species. That would be a small family. That would be about the size of a large genus in some groups, like some ants or something like that. So let's take a look at some of these. So here we have typical free-living earwigs. This is the one you're probably most familiar with. I believe this is Forficula auricularia, the common European earwig, invasive species in the U.S. Where we can see that cerci modified into pincer-like organs. On the inner side, they can have these kind of falcate, what does that mean? Kind of curved cerci with teeth on the inside. Here we see a species that has modifications. I believe this is a female. It's a relatively straight cerci, claspers. And here we see some males showing exaggeration of the shape, and also here's some of the asymmetricity. I don't think that's a word. The asymmetrical nature of the cerci. So that's your typical earwig. What about the atypical one? Oh, getting ahead of myself. I constantly do that, don't I? Let me show you how these earwigs, hidden beneath these forewings here, are large hind wings that enable it to fly. So let's see if I can get the video started. Let's try it. Wouldn't you just love to have your phone fold like an earwig's wing? That'd be pretty cool. Get my laser pointer back here. Okay, now to look at the. Oh, by the way, if you're into origami, I can point you to a publication that shows the pattern of folds, and I've done this. You can print that out on a Xerox machine, enlarge it, and actually fold your earwig wing together like they do under their body. So the two groups of parasitic earwigs don't have those clasping, those pinching like cerci. Their cerci are segmented like a normal circus is in most insects. But the two groups are the Hemimerina, this is the first one, that is parasitic on a variety of relatively large rodents from Africa. So here you can see one of these on the fur of the rodent here. So I mean, it really doesn't look much like an earwig, right? It does not have wings, so it's wingless. It has segmented cerci. These are tucked under on this guy. You'll see it in the next group. So it really doesn't look too much like an earwig. It looks like just kind of a generalized wingless Polyneopteran. The other one, this is the Eryxiniidae, that is parasitic on bats in Southeast Asia. Again, well, maybe these might give you kind of a hint of pincher-like cerci back here on the back end, but again, they're entirely wingless, just looking like a very generalized insect here. So those are the two parasitic groups. The vast majority of the Dermaptera are the free-living kinds that are primarily phytophagous, detritivores, occasionally predatory, but with these two lineages, which in the little bit, it was just recently that these have all been sunk together into the same suborders. So if you look at your literature that's more than 5 years old, then you'll see these groups referred to as different suborders of earwigs. So that was that first clade up here, the Zoroptera and the Dermaptera. Let's move on to the stoneflies. If you're a fisherman, you're very familiar with the order Plecoptera or stoneflies. Like the mayflies, they have aquatic immatures that are very important in the aquatic food chain, particularly in streams, and so trout fishermen are very well attuned to the diversity and the imitation of stonefly adults and nymphs as lures for catching fish. The stoneflies, let's see, they have aquatic immature stages. The adults are not aquatic. They are terrestrial. And the adults live for much longer periods of time than do the adults of mayflies, and they have functional mouth parts. The stoneflies are interesting in that if you look at their phylogeny, they're basically broken into two lineages. One in the northern part of the world, basically Laurasia, the northern continents, and a southern Gondwanan lineage. Some people have looked at and interpreted the Plecoptera as basically a very plesiomorphic Neoptera, and we're going to see in the context of Polyneoptera, we're going to see lots of little groups that are very highly specialized. Well, and even the Orthoptera, to be honest with you, are highly specialized, whereas these are relatively generic. And some people have also put a lot of emphasis on the idea that they have aquatic immature stages, reasoning that if the abdominal gills of mayflies are serially homologous with wings, and that wings initially evolved in an aquatic habitat, then the fact that these guys still retain aquatic immature stages might point to them being relatively basal on the phylogenetic tree. Reasonably diverse, 3,500 species. There's still lots of them being discovered as new species. Let's take a look at a few. This is an example of a Pteronarcis, the family of giant stoneflies, the Pteronarciidae. These can, while most stoneflies are relatively modest in size, a centimeter long, maybe 2-3 centimeters. These guys can be, the size of your pinky. They get to be quite large. So we have giant stoneflies. We have a whole cohort of things that are called winter stoneflies. There's multiple families that have this sort of habit. And what I mean by the habit is that the adults actually emerge during the winter time, mate and reproduce then, and so it's a good excuse to get out in the winter, get out and get a little bit of fresh air to go try to go collecting winter stoneflies. And so they do actually come out. The best place to catch them is to go find bridges over the streams, and they'll emerge and congregate underneath the bridges as an area in which to hide, and so you can find them there. As you can see here, some stoneflies, including some of our local species, are actually brachypterous. Brachypterous simply means that they have short wings. So the wings are really short and they're not functional. That's as large as the wings get in this particular species. This is an image of one of the very common immature stages. So this is a purlid, I believe. With, let's see, what shall we look at here? Well-developed antennae, well-developed cerci, and so if you pull out an aquatic nymph and it's only got the two cerci, no median caudal filament, then you can be pretty sure that what you have is a stonefly here. Typically, as their name implies, found under stones, so more or less flattened, sometimes extremely flattened. Maybe not so much as you see in some of the mayflies, but also you don't see any of those plate-like, wing-like gills on the abdomen of a stonefly. They do have gills, and let's see the next picture to show you that. And characteristically, the gills occur as these filamentous, finger-like outgrowths at the bases of the coccyx. And this is looking from a dorsal view, but you can see the gills here along the bases of the coccyx. And some of them also have gills at the bases of the mouth parts as well. And so that's what they're using to get oxygen out of the water. They're typical of well-aerated running water, although they can occur in other habitats as well. So racing through, let's go to the largest group of the Polyneoptera, the Orthoptera. And here, when I'm talking about large, we're talking about 20,000 species or so. So a vast, vast group, in which I have a vast, vast number of pictures to go through for you, showing you the interesting looking ones. So actually, I rearranged the order of these slides, so the fact that I put there again, I haven't gotten to the first instance of this. What I mean by that first phrase, again, same name, many concept, is that within the Polyneoptera, there's a few names that have been used in vastly different ways, and Orthoptera is one of them. In some cases, in the older literature, and I'm not talking that old, I'm talking about like when I was beginning to study taxonomy, the Orthoptera included basically almost, not all Polyneoptera, but a great many of the larger groups in Polyneoptera, including the cockroaches and the mantids and the walking sticks and things like that. Some of the really weird things like Zoraptor were never placed in Orthoptera, but Orthoptera used to be much more comprehensive. So if you see the term Orthoptera, you need to be sure that you and the author or the speaker are on the same wavelength, talking about the same group. So basically, I'm talking about Orthoptera in a very strict sense, and the easiest way to characterize these guys is to say that these are the Polyneopterans that are modified for jumping. There are some that are no longer modified for jumping, but the vast majority of them are. Species in this group are well known and well studied for their acoustic communication, so they communicate using sound, and the sound can be made in a couple of different ways. One is by the process of stridulation. Basically what stridulation is rubbing two parts of the body across one another. So there might be what's called a file or a series of ridges, and then a scraper on another part of the body. Classically, this is on one wing and the other wing. So one wing would have the file and the other wing would have the scraper. And by moving the wings, you would scratch across it and it would generate a sound that would in turn be amplified by the structure of the wings. The other and another place where you get stridulatory organs in the Orthoptera is on the combination of the hind legs and the wings. So one of your classic, a grasshopper, a melanoplus grasshopper, excuse me, they will have on the enlarged hind femur a series of pegs that then they scrape by rubbing their legs against the edge of the wings, and by rubbing against the raised veins on the forewing, they generate a sound. The other way that Orthoptera can generate sound is a process called crepitation, which is basically crackling. So when, for example, a Carolina locust takes off suddenly, if you've ever tried to catch them, they're always one step ahead of you, but you hear this crackling noise as it flies off. That's from the structure of the wings making that noise. That's not usually a form of communication between individuals, as you find with the stridulation. Excuse me. So if you're going to make sound, then you got to hear it in turn. And there are a couple of different ways that they use for hearing, and I'm not going to, other than just mentioning it here, I'm not going to go into any more detail on that. But things like the typical shorthorn grasshoppers, the family Acrididae, have a tympanum similar to your eardrum at the base of the abdomen, so that the sound waves, which are physical displacements of the air, cause the tympanum to move, and the movement of the tympanum is then detected by the nerves inserted there. The other way is to have a modification of the subgenual organ. The subgenual organ, that literally means below the knee. And so this is an organ, basically a thin membrane stretched across the lumen of the tibia, just near the articulation of the tibia with the femur, that almost all insects have, and usually it's used to detect vibrations in the substrate that the insect is on. So if the substrate vibrates, it causes the legs to start to vibrate, and then that vibration across the membrane within the leg, and there's a nerve that inserts on that membrane, and then that can transduce the motion of the membrane into a neuronal signal that it then interprets. And so the classic picture is of the katydids, the family Pterygonoideae, that have an enlarged subgenual organ forming an ear on their forelegs. And so acridids here with the tympanum on the base of the abdomen, Pterygonoids with the subgenual organ on their forelegs. Within the Orthoptera, we've got two massive lineages that form separate groups, and I'm going to take a quick run through some representatives, some of the more exotic and interesting, at least to me, representatives of these two groups. The first is what's called the Coelifera, and these are your classic grasshoppers. So the shorthorn grasshoppers, the Acrididae, things like the migratory locusts, Schistocerca and Locusta migratoria. Also other things like the tetragids, small groups, and some pretty bizarre groups in some cases. The other major group is called the Ensiphera, which includes the crickets and the Pterygonoids, or their common name is the longhorn grasshoppers. There are many groups that grow under the name of crickets. Some are in separate families, and even within the classic family of crickets, the Grillidae, there's some just awesome variation in body forms and colors of these animals. So let's start out with the Coelifera, the grasshoppers. Just to show you, I mean, everybody's familiar with acridids, I assume. the shorthorn grasshoppers. But these are some other families that belong to that same group. This is one that I grew to enjoy from field work in Brazil because they were fairly common in the habitat we were working at. It wasn't rainforest. This is savanna area. But the Eumastacida, I think their common name is something like monkey grasshoppers or something like that. This guy's about an inch long, and the colors are just fantastic on these things. And they kind of will sit there with that their legs splayed out like that. I'm sure that some of my wasps are egg parasites of these guys, but nobody's ever been able to prove it yet. So Eumastacids, very common in the tropics. The mirabids I put in here because if you recall back our discussion of modes of speciation, MJD White's idea of stasopathic speciation, he was looking at the family Mirabidae, and so this is an example of that. So these are they're found, they're widespread, but it's a very common group in Australia. Proscopiids, I didn't look up anything specific about proscopiids except in this case, you note tremendous sexual dimorphism. So here we have a mating pair. See back here, the male is mating with the female. This is the small male. This is the much larger female. No wings in these cases, and these just totally bizarre heads. It's almost comical heads on these things. Then of course we get into things like the acridiids and the romeliids, the classical grasshoppers or locusts, some of which are just extraordinarily brightly colored. In some cases proven, in many cases only suspected that this functions as aposematic coloration to warn off predators. They can be quite large in size, and so you would think would be a tasty morsel for some sort of insectivorous mammal or a bird or something like that. But their obviousness probably attests to the fact that they are very bad tasting and not good for them to eat. But again, large hind femora here, which is characteristics of these jumping groups, and we're going to see throughout the Orthoptera. Then there's some really worth. This creature is endemic to Australia. It's a separate family of coeliferans, and so this does not look at anything at all like a grasshopper. You can see they can be quite large in size. I've heard them. I've heard it said that they get up to like 3 inches in length. This is a creature that belongs to the family Cylindrochaetidae. The Aussies' common name for them is sand gropers. And so they're found in like Western Australia, burrowing underground, feeding upon most likely feeding upon plant material, roots and such underneath the ground. Okay, so let's then switch over to the Encifera, which are the most familiar ones to you, of course, are going to be the classic ground crickets, or well, let's call them ground crickets here, which you see an example here. These have many species are very famous for their acoustic communication. So, of course, the chirping of crickets at night, accomplished by the file and scraper mechanism of the two forewings rubbing on one another. So basically, they're using their flight muscles to rub their forewings together to produce the chirping at night. What can we see here? Enlarged hind femora, nice long cerci, extensive long appendicular ovipositors here. In the Encifera, the ovipositor, the Coelifera, excuse me. The ovipositor is much shorter and typically used as a digging organ to place the egg mass underground, whereas here we have more hypodermic needle-like ovipositor. So that's your classic kind of cricket. Maybe you're not used to that color, but that's, house crickets and ground crickets. You've seen things that look like this. Let's look at a little more diversity, though. This is the This is a local species in Ohio. It goes by a couple of different common names, the red-headed or the handsome bush cricket. So the red-headed bush cricket or the handsome bush cricket. The species Phylopalpus, which means leaf-like palpus. You can see the maxillary palpi, these huge things here. And Pulchellus just means beautiful. And this guy is about, I would say, max about a centimeter long, not counting the elongate antennae, of course. Local species. These are also local species. These are tree crickets. The genus Ecanthus, that's E spelled O-E, is a very common, has a lot of species. The snowy tree cricket is one of them. And as their name implies, they are characteristic of living in trees, ovipositing in small twigs, and feeding in trees. Very noticeable, very distinct song that they have, that they use, again, the same way as in the ground crickets, stridulation using the one pair of forewings. Some more bizarre kinds of things are like the gorilla talpids. Now we're starting to get into really weird stuff because we're going underground. Some crickets will live in shallow burrows underground, but now we're talking about things that are real burrowers, like the mole crickets or gorilla talpids. If you ever took mammalogy, the talpidae are moles, and so these are mole crickets, exactly what the name means. And you can see they have these enlarged forelegs with great processes developed off of them to increase the surface area for them to dig and burrow underground. They have wings, but of course, something as massive as this, those wings are not going to be worth anything in terms of generating flight. This is your classic Pterygoneid. Common name for these is the longhorn grasshoppers, because unlike the acridids, which have relatively short antennae, these guys can have extremely long antennae. It wouldn't even fit in this picture, probably longer than the entire length of the body. We can see here, see that what looks like a hole in the foreleg there? That's the opening to the subgenual organ that allows the animal to hear the songs that the males make. I can't tell. I can't tell if this is a male or a female. Sometimes the females have extremely elongate ovipositors. You could see it coming out the back end. This could actually be either. But same story. Communication via stridulation by the two forewings moving against one another. Some of these have tremendous coloration patterns that help them camouflage them. These guys can, of course, become extremely large. And while we typically think of Orthoptera as phytophagous insects, there are many Pterygoneids that are actually carnivorous, predatory. In fact, some of these are big enough that if you pick them up, they could give you a nasty little bite and actually draw blood by biting you. Here's one of those camouflage patterns. If you can't tell, this is the head over on this end, and then this looks just like a dead leaf with mottled patches of fungus on it, and even a little bite where some caterpillar had been chewing on this leaf a long time. So excellent patterns of camouflage. But also, so the kind of things that we normally think of as katydids and longhorn grasshoppers, there's a lot more diversity, and there's probably a lot of work yet to do on the internal phylogeny of the Pterygoneidae. This massive creature is known as an armored bush cricket, and this is native to the southern part of the African continent, where it can be a pretty severe pest in crops like sorghum and millet and the like. And you can see why they call it an armored bush cricket. It's just these massive, huge spines coming out of its back, and of course, given the size of this animal, you can easily imagine that it can have a tremendous impact on a plant, probably eat a whole plant by itself. In the family Stenopalmatidae, Although this is a pretty bizarre looking creature, this family is actually does also occur in North America, particularly in the West. One of the common species there is known as the Mormon cricket, or let's see, what are they also called? The Niños de Jesus, because they're large and they come out uh, in swarms, and in fact, Mormon crickets have been known to swarm, and actually, although they can't fly, are almost as bad as some of the plague locusts in terms of their numbers and their impact on crops. You see this massive head, and that the massive head, of course, implies that within it are massive muscles that are moving its mandibles. So it's got tremendous biting and chewing power. Enlarged legs, all legs are enlarged. Much of its life is spent burrowing underground, and of course it's wingless as well. This guy is known as the Kulula monster. This family, the classification that people are arguing about it, sometimes it's classified in its own family, the Kululidae. There is a national park in Australia called Kulula National Park where this was first discovered, and so that's how it got its name. I think there's a grand total of like 4 species, maybe a half dozen species of these things. Endemic to Australia, so we're talking about Eastern Australia here, Queensland, and that area. And these are just a mystery. They're sexually dimorphic. The males are winged and a little bit more heavily melanized than this female. The males will sometimes come out and you can find them on the surface of the ground at night, but the females spend almost their entire life burrowing underground. What are they doing? Well, nobody knows for sure, but the mouth parts are modified such that it looks like they might actually be predatory and not feeding on roots, or maybe they're doing both. Who knows? It's just a bizarre creature, about the size of a small mouse or something like that. They call them monsters for a reason. And speaking of monsters, the largest of insects in terms of mass. Is that right? Well, let's say one of the largest insects in terms of mass is found in the family Stenopalmatidae, and these are the wettas. Wettas, these families are found elsewhere, but the name wetta is a name from New Zealand, where some of these creatures, as you can see, reach just monstrous proportions. This is, you can easily tell that this is a female, got a very clear ovipositor back here, chewing down on a carrot. So she's only in New Zealand, right, where the parrots are flightless and the orthopterans grow to the size of rather large mice. Would you find something like this? Some of these get actually even more bizarre with great sexual dimorphism. For example, this is a male. Again, you can see the ears on the forelegs here, but you see this guy has the mandibles, of course, tremendously exaggerated, and I'll bet you dollars to donuts that these are for intermale aggression in order to get mating rights to any females that come along the way. And so this just gets some really fantastic creatures within the Orthoptera, much beyond our stereotypes of house crickets and Melanoplus grasshoppers. Okay, after gushing over the Orthoptera, let's move on to some really, really bizarre things. So we finished here. We're now going to move in this clade here, subtended by number 124, starting up here with these 2 orders, the Mantophasmatodia and the Grylloblattoidea, the 2 most recently described orders of insects. Starting with the Mantophasmatodians. These were separated out as a distinct order of insects only in I say only in 2002, so less than 20 years ago, were these recognized as being so different that they deserve to be placed in a separate order. They had been, species had been known from fossils. There's fossils of these things in Baltic amber, but then they discovered some living species in Africa. And initially, this was more or less confined to South Africa, Botswana, this part of the continent. But more recent studies have found more species farther north, up all the way up into Kenya and East Africa. And so now, excuse me, now we're at the grand total of 19 living species of Mantophasmatodians. And you can see how highly dissected the taxonomy is, because those 19 species are found in, no, 17 is too high. I think it is 4, 2, so about 15 different genera. There's only, I miscounted because there's only 2 genera that have more than one species in them. One has 4 species and one has 2 species. And these guys are predators, but they don't look like your normal predators. This is one hanging from a leaf. They are all entirely wingless, so they're flightless, and sometimes they're called heel walkers because of the way that they seem to walk on the basotarsus of the leg and not on the full, the full plantigrade stance with all the tarsomeres in contact with the ground. Looking at them, they seem rather generalized. There's nothing, what can you say? Long antennae, mandibulate mouth parts, nothing particularly unusual about their legs other than this business about how they walk. Generalized abdomen, very nondescript, I think was the word I would use for them. It's just they didn't fit anywhere else. They seemed like they were kind of a cross between, they look like mantids in some ways, in other ways they look like walking sticks. What are we going to do with them? Until finally it was decided, and this has been subsequently supported by molecular evidence, that they're actually not related to, closely related to any of those, but deserve to be placed in their own group. Not much more to say about them. So let's move on to the next order, the Grilloblattids. Or I say Grilloblattids. There's only one family in there. That's why I would say Grilloblattids instead of Grilloblattodia. This group has also been called Notoptera. And sometimes the Mantophasmatodians and the Grilloblattodians are combined into a single order. So your typical little taxonomic tete-a-tete to try to come to a decision. Very few species, I forgot to write down the numbers here, found at in the high altitude mountains of the western Nearctic region, so US and Canada, and also in Eastern Asia. They're only active at low temperatures, and actually what they do is that they are predators, or maybe scavengers is a better word, for arthropods that have been blown onto glaciers or snow fields, and because of the low temperatures they can't move around. The Grilloblattids come out at night looking for these insects to feed on. So predators or scavengers. I believe you saw this, representative of this in the lab, courtesy of one of our former, he is a current OSU alumnus who is now doing graduate work at UC Riverside. And he made a point to send me a Grilloblattid from one of their trips in the mountains to collect them. And so this is what they look like. Again, nondescript, kind of cylindrical body, elongate, cerci. Appendicular ovipositor is interesting. Mandibulate mouth parts, long antennae, wingless, no special modifications of legs or anything like this. So they're fairly large in terms of body size, but very depauperate in terms of number of species. Both the Mantophasmatodians were described as a separate order in 2002. The Grilloblattids were described as a separate order, I believe, in the 1920s or thereabouts. Moving on to the Embiodyna. These guys are just out. They're out in left field in terms of just in terms of morphology, nobody knew where to put these because they're just so unique. But you've seen where the transcriptomic data put them. Characteristics of, well, first of all, Embiodyna you will also see commonly in the literature, including in the Mesoff article, called the Embioptera. The admittedly very few living specialists on web spinners, which is their common name, have decided that they prefer to use the name Embiodyna, so I'm going with the flow with them. One of the very unique characteristics of them is that the four tarsi, the tarsi of the forelegs, the basal segment is swollen, and it contains silk glands, and they use the silk of these glands to line their nest. They live in groups. The females are wingless, and this is kind of rationalized by they have to move through these silken tunnels, either underground or in decaying trees or things like this. And they need to be able to back up, and that would be hard to do if you had wings, right? And so the females are wingless, where the males are winged. Alate means that they have wings. They're semisocial. That means that they are living together in colonies. They haven't advanced to the stage of eusociality, which I'm going to get to at the end of this video, but they do live in colonies. There aren't many species. There's only about 400 species, but some of them are really quite beautiful. Let's see, what do we got here? This is a typical female. The cerci, which in the female look normal. In the male, this guy is not illustrating it so clearly, but often in the male, the cerci are sexually they're sexually dimorphic, and in the male, the cerci are asymmetrical. Elongate cylindrical body, chewing mouth parts. Here you can see that enlarged basetarsal segment. You can also see it here in the male. That contains the silk glands, which exudes all of this massive silk that you see these two individuals standing on. And here's the silken tunnels of a nest here. The males are winged. One of the classic stories from my days as an undergraduate was when Professor Krzyzewski was telling us about the Embioptera in those days. He was very smugly relating the story of some hotshot graduate student who went on a collecting field trip to, I believe it was Archbold Biology Station in Florida, South Central Florida, and one of these males came to the light, and he was a hotshot who knew everything. He could not figure out for the life of him what order this creature belonged to. I guess he didn't cotton on to the enlarged basetarsal, 4 basetarsal segments as the identifier characteristic. But they don't all have to be, uniform and boring in color. This guy's got a nice, beautiful red thorax to go along with the darkened wings. Moving on to walking sticks, the Phasmatodea. What can we say about them? Herbivorous. They hold the record for being the longest insect. As an entomologist, you're always going to be asked, what's the biggest insect? And you have to then ask them, what do you mean by big? Do you mean body mass? In which case, it's either one of those Wetos or the Goliath beetle. Or do you mean the longest insect? The record for the longest insect is a walking stick from Borneo, approximately 2 feet long. I want to point out one interesting and important group that is the basal lineage of the Phasmatodea, and these are the Timemids. Timemids are endemic to the western U.S. and they have been organisms that have been studied intensively for to understand their patterns of speciation. I think I'll save the rest of that story for a picture I've got of them coming up. Phasmids are relatively diverse. 3,000 species worldwide. We only have a single species here in our area, but they get more diverse, especially in the tropics. I think the most diverse place in the world is the island of Borneo in terms of the number of different species of walking sticks that they have. Some species are winged and can fly. Some species are wingless. And so there's a fair amount of diversity in that aspect of their biology too. Here's one of those massive walking sticks. So this is from Western China, so Sichuan area. Let's see, I believe the finger is pointing to the head. So this animal is actually holding its forelegs out in front of it to give it more of an appearance of an elongate stick. So here's actually the body running the length here. And so they're, even so, they're pretty darned impressive insects. And they're really hard to see. Even if so they're big, the camouflage works really, really well. This is a Tamema on, I believe this is this looks like a U needle. So you can see it's kind of got that walking stick sort of a body plan going here, elongate, camouflage, even to the point of you see the two white lines on the U needle. You can see the two white lines here. So the Tamemids, there seems to be some specialization on different host plants and the development of host races. The same sort of thing as, same sort of idea as the Regalitas fruit fly, apple maggot story, that these might be speciating as a consequence of their specialization on their food plant. So these guys have been the subject of extensive studies for sympatric speciation and what's called ecological speciation. I mean, speciation in which natural selection is actually pushing these things to diversify. And of course, you're always familiar with things like these jungle nymphs, which we actually ran across in Borneo. And as I said, are tremendously difficult to see when they're in the wild. They had, for them, the bad habit of coming out at night on the boardwalk. We were in basically a peat swamp area. So there was a boardwalk you could get through dry, and these guys would come out and walk on it, and then in the morning they would be stranded there. They're very easy to see and play with. Then they're fun to play with. But I put this picture up because the phasmids are famous for their eggs, believe it or not. That the eggs, the chorion of the egg has this. Some of them have just these absolutely extravagant patterns, and the shell is very thick. And when the phasmids oviposit, they don't oviposit in the sense of placing their egg within a little niche or within some plant tissue or something. Basically, they expel them, and they expel them with force. I was at the International Congress of Entomology in Brisbane some years ago, and they had in the main display area, where all the vendors go, they had a big cage with these guys in them, and you could actually hear them ovipositing because they would shoot their egg and it would land on the ground. You could actually hear them expelling and hear the eggs hitting the ground. So basically they just drop their eggs on the forest floor where they then hatch. Many of these species can actually be identified by the patterns of the chorion and at the end of the egg. They're so elaborate. Oh, geez, where are we? Last group to go, the mantids and the Blatodia. So we're talking about node number 117 here, subtending all of these. You're all familiar with mantids, so I don't think, and they're not. I mean, there are people who love them, such as a colleague up at the Cleveland Museum of Natural History, Gavin, but they're not tremendously diverse in terms of they look to be almost all doing the same sort of thing. Mantids are predaceous, and a couple of things are pretty famous about them. First of all, I guess I should just say there's about 2,500 species, something on that order, and some of them are just. I mean, you really have to go Google images of mantids to see some of these just wild color patterns and extravagant bodies. I'm not going to delve into that. I'm going to show you some more normal sorts of mantids here. But two things they are famous for is that because they are predators, sit and wait predators, they're not go chase you down sorts of predators by and large. They are notorious for having very good vision, and in fact they have an area of the eye that functions like our fovea, where you get a high resolution image, and presumably this helps them to visually make visual contact with a prey item and accurately attack it with their enlarged forelegs. They're also famous for something called the cyclopean ear. This is something that was studied as long ago as the 50s. Cyclopean referring to the fact that just as Cyclops in Greek mythology had a single eye in the middle of its forehead, the mantid has a single ear, not a pair of ears on either leg where it can kind of triangulate on where sound's coming from, but a single ear along its ventral midline. So let's look at this a little bit. So here's just I'm only going to go into this smattering. Here we have a typical sort of mantid. I wanted to put up these guys. This is the mating pair, male and female. Some mantids are not the big gaudy things with the really elongate prothorax, but the prothorax is shorter, and they can. Some mantids will have just absolutely garish colors, while others will blend in either with the greens of leaves or on the mottled background of bark of a tree where they may be sitting and running around. Mantids are also famous for the production of what are called oothecae, or a package within which the eggs are contained. And in fact, around here, the way to find mantid eggs is to go out in winter when there aren't leaves in the trees and look for these things attached to the twigs and branches. They'll also lay oothecae, under stones and things like that. Those are a bit harder to find. And here we see an ootheca in which the immature mantids have begun to emerge and will now disperse, because of course they're predatory as well. And if you don't give them an option, if you're rearing them at home, they will eat each other quite happily. This is a picture of that. Oh, I can't go back. Go back for me on that previous picture, and you see the two little spots on the green mantid's eyes. That's the fovea. That's the area. That's not an artifact. That's an area showing you their increased visual resolution in the eye. So if it looks like a mantid's looking at you, it's because he is looking at you. This is the ear of a mantid here, right there, slit there, that with which it's thought. There's some experimental evidence to support this, but it's used to listen for the cries of bats. The signal, the vocalizations of bats by which they echolocate to prey. Many mantids will be flying around at night, typical Friday night football here in Central Ohio when we had it, when they get the spotlights up and you could see mantids flying around the lights at the stadium. Anyway, these are great food items for bats, but they can hear the ultrasonic cries of the bats using the ear, which, as I said, is located along the ventral midline of the body between the mid legs and the hind legs. Cyclopean because it's not paired. So they can't really distinguish where the sound is coming from. It's coming from my left, it's coming from my right, but they can detect that there's a bat in the vicinity and take evasive maneuvers in order to avoid being crunched by a bat's mandible. And so that finally brings us to the last order. This video is taken a little bit longer, but I'm not grossly over, so maybe another few minutes. The Blattodea. So here, beware of the name. The name Blattodea, or actually the name Dictyoptera is the one I want to focus on. You'll see this used in a lot of different senses in the entomological literature. So you need to be careful to understand what the author or the speaker is referring to if they're using the term Dictyoptera. Some people will use Dictyoptera to refer only to cockroaches, some to cockroaches plus termites, some to mantids plus cockroaches plus termites, some sort of the walking sticks in there. So it really is important to kind of keep it straight of what they're talking about. And that's why I've chosen to use the word Blattodea and not Dictyoptera, just because Dictyoptera ends up being so confusing. In general, um, well, the co-author on your textbook, Chuck Triplehorn, always tries to make me accept his point that these guys should be called cockroaches and not roaches, because a roach is a type of fish. To which my response is that's a common name and I'll call it whatever I please. Anyway, we don't need to get into that argument. Cockroaches, I'll try to just use the term cockroaches, are generally herbivorous or omnivorous. Basically, they'll eat anything they can get a hold of. They're remarkable in the diversity in their reproductive patterns. There are oviparous cockroaches, that is, cockroaches like you would expect would lay eggs. The embryo develops in the eggs, and then the nymph hatches out of the eggs. Often they'll package these eggs together within a sclerotized case called an ootheca, just like, well, not just like, but similar to the mantids, functionally similar to. So there'll be many eggs within a single ootheca. But then there are cockroaches that will retain either an ootheca or retain the eggs within the female's body. The embryos develop within those eggs, and then the nymphs hatch out of the eggs, but the eggs are never laid. This is called ovoviviparity. So it's kind of a halfway point between live birth, viviparous, which also occurs in the cockroaches, so they don't produce chorionated eggs per se, and oviparous, where they do. Ovoviviparous is kind of somewhere in between. So all of these are found within cockroaches. So you find many cockroaches that give birth to live nymphs. Of course, cockroaches, cockroaches and most famously termites are very famous for their gut symbionts, which turn out to be incredibly diverse. And I think it's still quite an open question of how they acquire the symbionts. What was the phylogenetic pattern in which these things were acquired? I must admit I'm a bit out of touch on current research on the evolution of gut symbionts within the Blattodea, but it's a fascinating area. The consensus of opinion now, as reflected in the Misoff et al. Article, is that termites represent a specialized group of cockroaches. But they have been so highly specialized, and of course they have such economic importance that they were, for many years, and just until the most recent years, been continually recognized as a separate order. Termites are basically social cockroaches, and when I say social, I mean eusocial. So let's define what eusocial means, or eusociality. The EU part of that word means true. So the most highly developed form of sociality, social behavior. That entails three criteria: an overlap of generations, so adults and young living together, a cooperative brood care, so the adults of one generation are assisting the young of the next generation to grow, feeding them, cleaning them, carrying out any that died, getting rid of nest parasites, things like that. So cooperative brood care of offspring that are not necessarily your own, which leads to the final criterion, is that there's a reproductive division of labor. That is, some individuals within a eusocial insect colony will reproduce, and some will not. So we typically call the ones that reproduce, we call them queens. And a eusocial insect colony may have a single queen, or in which case it would be monogynous, or it may have multiple queens, polygynous colony. There's lots of variation across all the eusocial insects. Let's see here. Of course, eusociality occurs in the Isoptera. I think we can still call them Isoptera. We just won't recognize them as an order. But in the termites, and also most famously in the Hymenoptera, where it evolved several times, but in several other groups of insects and actually other arthropods. This is not something that had been widely recognized. So we have eusocial aphids, we have eusocial thrips, we have eusocial beetles. So eusociality has those three criteria. If you drop out one, or two of these criteria, then you're talking about things that go by the name of subsocial or parasocial or semisocial. So they have some of the features of a eusocial colony, but not all three together at the same time. Termite colonies, I'm sure probably you all know this, but let me just run across it very quickly. The colonies are bisexual, including both males and females. They can be monogynous or polygynous. The female will typically mate many times. A reproductive female, the queen, will mate many times during the course of her life. So it's not like the hymenopteran colonies where the reproductive females mate only once, or at least at one time, perhaps with several different males, but they only mate at that one period of time. And in a termite colony, the non-reproductive castes, the workers, the soldiers, sometimes even the workers are broken down into majors and minors, these things. These are immature stages. So these are immature individuals that under some conditions can complete their development to maturity and become reproductives. Typically when the colony order, the presence of queens gets disrupted. So this contrasts with the other famous eusocial insects, the bees, ants, and wasps, where the non-reproductive castes are all adult females. And the termites, they're all immatures. I want to mention the basal lineage of the termites, the Australian genus Mastotermes. Actually, there's only one species living of Mastotermes called Mastotermes darwiniensis, which is found it's widespread in Australia. In fact, it's quite a pest in Australia. They form large colonies, but it's also known from fossils as well, other different species. And so the most basal termite lineage is still extant, and we can study its biology in detail, and people have studied it. So let's wrap up by looking at some pictures of Blatodians. The whole point of this picture is to get the American cockroach and the German cockroach and the brown-banded cockroach and the oriental cockroach totally out of your mind and say, there are some absolutely gorgeous cockroaches. That's a cockroach. That's not a ladybird beetle. That's a cockroach. Well, maybe that does look like a cockroach burrowing in the sand. But the ones that we're familiar with as pests are only a minute part of all the diversity of cockroaches, and some of them are very fascinating. I want a special shout out here to the family Cryptocercidae, which is, I believe there's only a single family of Cryptocercus, and a single species in the single genus of this family, and it occurs in the Appalachians, and in fact it occurs in Ohio. And it's an interesting cockroach because it has subsocial behavior, not true sociality as in the termites, but they do have overlap of generations. They live together in colonies in decaying wood or in the soil, that kind of interface. Overlap of generations and brood care, where the adults are collectively caring for the offspring. And whether this is a direct pointer to the precursor of the evolution of eusociality, or just an indication that because they're relying upon these gut symbionts, maybe that predisposes these animals to live together in groups where in such situations the tendency has been to acquire traits that are associated with sociality. So termites become eusocial. The fact that all termites are eusocial implies that it evolved only once. Doesn't prove it, but it does imply it. And maybe the cryptocercids are either on that route toward eusociality, or they're just a separate experiment with that sort of behavior. Here we have some typical termites. Here we have a worker. So remember, an immature stage here. This is a queen. Where's off to the side with the enlarged abdomen. So she's basically an egg-laying machine at this point and is barely capable of movement, but can help to regulate the colony through pheromone production and the like. And some of the workers, like that last one, look, very generalized, mandibulate mouth parts, no wings, not much to them. But some of them, like these, this is the genus Nasutotermes, and these are called nasute soldiers. They have the head modified. So this is the only picture I put in this this deck of slides. I guess we don't call them decks in PowerPoint days, but they have typical mandibulate mouth parts located down underneath here. But the forehead, the frons, is produced into this basically a big nozzle that projects out, and they have glands inside the head that produce defensive sticky secretions that they shoot out of these nozzles on their heads if the colony is attacked. And so they are very effective and very, very distinctive sorts of defensive mechanisms for colonies, because a huge termite colony is just a bonanza of food for many organisms. Anteaters, pangolins, aardvarks, go on down the list. They need to protect themselves somehow. This is the genus Mastotermes. So we have typical workers, and this is a soldier. The soldier, in this case, has an enlarged, heavily sclerotized head capsule. You probably can't tell that it's more heavily sclerotized, but you can certainly see that it's more heavily melanized, which is often correlated. There's a correlation between melanization and the darkening and sclerotization, the actual hardening of the head capsule. But it does have these elongate, sharply pointed mandibles here. So this is that most primitive group of termites. I did use the word primitive, I'm sorry. The most basal lineage of termites. This is Mastotermes darwiniensis from Australia. So with that, I can't summarize the features of all 10 orders on one slide. So let me just say that the points of emphasis here were, I wanted to explain to you what wing flexion is and how it works. So it's basically the rotation of that third axillary sclerite to fold the wing over the back. Polyneoptera are, overall, they're very generalized insects with lots of plesiomorphic characters. And it has traditionally been difficult to figure out how they're interrelated, and maybe we're finally making some progress on that. Within this massive grouping, there are several small, in terms of number of species, and specialized lineages: Zoraptora, Embiodyna, gorilla blatids, Mantophasmatodians. So, very small numbers of species there. Less than, I think the Embiodyna are the most diverse. I'm sure the Embiodyna are the most diverse, and there's only a few hundred species of those. On the other end of the scale, we have the typical Orthoptera, the jumping Orthoptera, where we have tens of thousands of species of those things found all over the world, many of them very important pests of agriculture. We have the elements of sociality appearing. Well, we have some of them in the Embiodyna, to be sure, and perhaps even in the Zoraptora, but particularly in the Blatodia, and it reaches its most extravagant development in the eusocial colonies of termites. And I just want to again emphasize what the definition of eusociality is: overlapping generations, cooperative brood care, and reproductive division of labor. So that's it for Polyneoptera. I know that was a mouthful. The next time we'll move on to what used to be called the Paraneoptera, but which Misov et al. Has disrupted my lecture schedule by saying that it is not a monophyletic group, but nevertheless I'm going to treat them in a single lecture. So we'll have that for next time. Until then, stay safe, and I'll talk to you soon. Bye.